The word capitalism, very interesting word. The problem with that is the same problem with so many words in the political debate today, is that they have different meanings depending on who's using the word. We hear a lot today about we must get rid of the capitalist system. You hear that a lot from people who are worried about the banking crisis, worried about the economy, and they think that somehow that's related to capitalism. And so the big cry is, capitalism is the enemy. Get rid of capitalism and go to socialism or communism or fascism or something else, anything other than capitalism, because that's the big bad boy. And, it's easy to fall for that, but the problem is that we don't have clear definitions for these words that everybody agrees to. And it's like a Tower of Babel. So let's deal with that a little bit. Classically, the definition of capitalism used to mean that it was a system in which all property and means of production were privately owned. And that was usually the opposite of socialism or communism, where there was no private property, it was outlawed, and all the means of production supposedly were owned by the people. That's the idea behind it. But when you analyze it, it falls apart, because all property, whether it's private property like the shirt I'm wearing, or the car I'm driving, or the drill press that's used to drill a hole in a piece of machinery to make goods and services and so forth, all of these things are owned by someone under any system. The definition of ownership means the right to control something. If you can control something, you own it in the higher sense. You may not have a piece of paper that says you own it. It may not have your name on it. It's the title of ownership. But if you can determine what that piece of equipment is used for, or who can have access to it. For example, most of the wealthiest people in the world today have very little ownership of property. They've been very careful to get their names off of the title of ownership. When you see a very wealthy person driving around in a limousine, for example, chances are he doesn't own that limousine. He's probably leasing it, you see. Or maybe it's the property of a non-profit corporation, which is they've made the limousine available to him because he's the chairman of the board or something like that. He doesn't own that. Perhaps he lives in a house that he doesn't own. He doesn't have title to it for good reason, because if you have title to a piece of property, maybe somebody will sue you and take it from you. But if you don't have title to it, then nobody can take it from you in a lawsuit. So we've evolved into a society where it should be more clear today to see that the real test of ownership is not whether your name is on a piece of paper and the paper says title of ownership, but whether or not you can control how that property is used and who has access to it. That's the real test. And so under all systems, whether they be communist or socialist or so-called capitalist, there's always someone who can determine how property is used, who has access to it, and so forth. Those are the true owners. And then the communist and socialist systems, the commissars and the administrators are the owners, literally, in that sense. They're the owners of all of the property that they say belongs to the people. Sure, the people own it, but the people are told what time they can go visit the parks and what time they have to be out of the parks. If you own something, you can sell it, can't you? Well, just try and sell your share of the national forest, for example. It's nonsense. It's propaganda to try and convince people that there is such a thing as people's property. It's just part of the word game to get them to go along with a system in which the people have no ownership of anything. They'll be lucky if they own their socks and can determine which socks they put on in the morning. So we get back to this question of ownership and capitalism, and that's the real word there, because the idea is that individuals should have the right to own or determine access to a piece of property, whether it's the land they built their house on, whether it's their car or their clothes, and so forth. So when people say down with capitalism, they're usually saying down with private ownership. They do not want individuals to own anything. What they really want is for the commissars and the administrators of the state to own everything. That's really what they're saying. If they understood that, I don't think they'd be quite as enthusiastic about it. And the other part of the problem is that the banking crisis today has nothing to do with private ownership of property. The banking crisis is a result of fraud, and it's a result of legally protected fraud, which means that the bankers and the politicians have gone into partnership together, and the trouble we're having with the banks is that the government is protecting the banks, keeping them from failing, supposedly in the benefit of the people, you help the people and all of that, but it doesn't help the people. It puts the people further into debt. It inflates the prices of everything. Meanwhile, the bankers are doing quite well, thank you. Those bankers are not capitalists. Most of those bankers, I guess the best word you would say for them is they're collectivists, which is another word of saying socialists. In every socialist country, you've got bankers, don't you? So what's the deal here? You see, where the problem is that words mean different things to different people. I have often said that if we stripped away all of these words, like communism versus capitalism versus socialism, fascism, Nazism, left versus right, conservative versus liberal, all of these words get in the way. The whole ideology boils down to a choice between two things. One is individualism, and the other is collectivism. Those words have meaning. They're not familiar to us, but if you look them up in the dictionary, you'll find pretty clear definitions that everybody can agree on. You may not like the definition. You might say, well, I prefer to be a collectivist rather than an individualist, but it's pretty clear what it means. Individualism simply, in a general sense, means that the basis of society is the individual. That's the most important element in society. And the purpose of the state is to protect the individual. And the state is the servant of the people. That's individualism. Collectivism, it's the other way around. The collectivists believe that the state or the group is the most important element of society. And the purpose of the people is to serve the state. And there's your choice. Everything boils down to that today. And if we had individualism in America today, as we used to, we don't have it anymore, but if we had it today, we would not have this banking crisis, because the banks are getting away literally with legalized plunder because they're in bed with the politicians and they're using the state in order to plunder the people legally. If people understood that, they wouldn't go into the streets and say, get rid of capitalism. What they'd be saying is, let's get rid of socialism, let's get rid of communism, let's get rid of fascism, let's get rid of collectivism. That's the real word that covers all of that, and let's go back to individualism. Now, within that discussion of capitalism and socialism and left versus right, if you want to really look at the word capitalism, you could say, okay, let's deal with that. Let's accept that word. What does that mean? As I said before, classically it means the private ownership of property and the means of production. But as I also said, all property and means of production is owned by someone. But there could be within that definition two types of capitalism. One would be free enterprise capitalism. That means the private ownership of property and the means of production by individuals, and they're competing with each other in the free market. They're doing what they can in order to make as much money as they can, but the only way they can make more money is by finding a solution to the needs and the desires of the buyers. In other words, to become wealthy in a free market economy, in a free enterprise system, you have to produce what the consumers want. Otherwise, your competitor will do it and you're out and he's in. But in the other kind of capitalism, which I call monopoly capitalism, that's the system we're living under today. Under monopoly capitalism, people don't get rich by producing better goods and services at lower prices. They get rich by going to the halls of Congress and paying off the politicians to draft laws that legally protect them in commerce and give them an advantage over their competition. So now they get rich because of political influence, and the politicians give them monopolies in the marketplace. That's the kind of capitalism we have today. And so it's as clear as black and white. Free enterprise capitalism is the basis of individualism. Monopoly capitalism is the basis of collectivism.